She was a widow, wealthy, educated, and she turned her manor into a palace no one dared name out loud. In 1763, on the outskirts of São Paulo, a large sugar estate called Santa Eulália changed the map of power and shame in the province. What began as private indulgence, according to archival testimony, became a public catastrophe that would leave bodies, courts, and official records struggling to make sense of how private vice could ignite open revolt. Content warning. This narrative discusses sexual exploitation and corporal punishment within the system of enslavement. Scenes of abuse and violence are described in clinical and non-sensational terms to preserve dignity. Viewer discretion advised. Santa Eulália sat low among the cane fields, its barrow and tile silhouette cutting a figure both ordinary and extraordinary. A working ingenio, storehouses, slave quarters, and a main house large enough to host visiting officials. The estate's sugar production tied it into provincial networks of credit and labor. Its coastal access routes and the river beyond made it strategically valuable to merchants and to those who policed the colony. To live at Santa Eulália was to occupy a crossroads of wealth and governance, a place where personal sentence and public law met with blunt force. At the center of this place stood Antônia Maria de Souza y Melo, called by contemporaries the Mistress, by records and rumor alike. She had inherited land and status through marriage and then widowhood, and sources suggest she possessed unusual familiarity with bookkeeping, letters, and estate management for a woman of the province. According to parish notes and notarial records cited in later inquiries, she read correspondence, issued orders, and negotiated with suppliers and overseers in a way that unsettled neighbors accustomed to more circumscribed female roles. Whether she cultivated that perception intentionally, as power, or merely assumed it through the necessities of running a large ingenio, the effect was the same. Antônia inhabited a space of near absolute control over people and goods on Santa Eulália. Behind the facade of plantation life lay the senzalas, the quarters where the majority of the enslaved lived, ate, and endured. Those buildings were low and hot, their dirt floors and close stalls the province's economy embodied in timber and sweat. Men and women destined to perform the violent choreography of cane cutting, boiling, and repair slept there in numbers and conditions that left little margin for privacy, dignity, or rest. Their days were measured in rations and whips. Their futures were certified by marks and bills, by sales and ledgers. The estate's laborers learned to count not only cane, but the ways power could be dispensed: a plate of extra food, a kind word, a promise, or the sudden public display of punishment. Into that architecture of naked coercion, Antônia carved a second structure, a private wing of the main house that some records later called the Casa Grande. According to depositions preserved in the Inquisition archive, the Casa Grande was furnished and staffed with an attention that resembled an affluent household's drawing room rather than a planter's bedroom. Draperies, mirrors, and lacquered furniture are listed in inventories and witness statements that survive in fragments. Luxury goods, silk, jewelry, imported perfumes, appear in the papers not as mere ornaments, but as instruments in a system of domination. They were the currency of reward and humiliation, the outward signs of a hierarchy she drew within the house itself. It is important to say at once, when archival papers speak of gatherings in that wing, they use language that, from our vantage, indicates sexual exploitation organized and institutionalized by the mistress. The records are not a clean mirror. They reflect a contested reality. Some depositions name a precise number of favored men, others are less specific. According to the Inquisition file lodged later in Lisbon, 8 enslaved men are repeatedly named among her favorites: Benedito, Joaquim, Sebastião, Antonio, Francisco, Miguel, Carlos, and Domingos, but in other summaries that precise count is indefinido. What is consistent across testimony is the pattern. A small cadre of favored men received material perks and positions of informal power, while the majority of the enslaved population endured increased scarcity and surveillance. Those favored men, when they appear in the records, are more than props. They had biographies, skills, and relationships that made them useful to Antonia beyond the private chamber. Take Benedito. The documents portray him as literate, unusually so for an enslaved man on a provincial estate. He handled accounts, read letters, and was often the intermediary between the mistress and suppliers or agents who could not or would not cross her door. His literacy made him valuable. It also made him dangerous to others. Benedito could transcribe promises and shape the narrative around the privileges he received. The archive suggests he learned to wield the mistress's favors into a form of soft authority over other enslaved people, a middleman between desire and command. Joachim and Sebastian are sketched in different strokes. Joachim appears in depositions as steady and muscular, one who could be trusted in the mill, who had a son in the senzalas known to neighbors. Sebastian appears as a man who kept his head down and did his work, yet when granted clothing or a plate of better food, he was seen more often near the main house than among workers.
Miguel, Antonio, Francisco, Carlos, and Domingos surface in inventories, testimony, and cross-examination. Recipients of small allowances of tobacco and sugar, assigned to perform errands in the household, ushered to the mistress's presence with a degree of deferential ceremony that exposed the mechanics of favoritism. Brief vignettes recorded in different depositions humanize them. Miguel's laugh in the mill, Francisco's careful mending of boots, Carlos's devotion to an older woman in the senzalas. These details matter because they show how famine and favor were not abstract forces but concrete relations between named bodies. The transformation of the manor into a private palace did not occur overnight. It was a process of accretion, new curtains, a reallocation of rooms, a redefinition of who could enter which threshold. According to house inventories and inventories' echoes in inquisitorial testimony, a domestic reorganization gave rise to a specialized suite, chambers for the favorites, a room for attendants, a private kitchen wing, and a set of rules enforced by selected overseers. The Casa Grande was not simply a space of pleasure. It was an administrative innovation, a way for the mistress to govern certain bodies differently, rewarding them materially for loyalty and for service in enforcing secrecy. The rituals that developed there had rules. Some testimonies speak of appointments and roles. A favored man would be named to the mistress's table. Another would carry messages to visitors. One would act as a sort of valet. Small titles were given and then reinforced by gifts: a silk sash, a copper coin, a piece of imported cloth. The records mention promises, spoken, sometimes written, that suggested possibilities for manumission or relocation. Whether Antonia ever intended to honor those promises or whether they were a tool of control is disputed in the papers. Some witnesses insisted she offered formal instruments or testimonies supporting freedom. Others remembered glinting words that failed to materialize as papers. Here the archive grows murky. Promises are recorded, but fulfillment is indefinido. Power depends as much on spectacle as on secrecy. Within the walls of the Casa Grande, Antonia staged her authority. Visitors who came to the house reported, according to later depositions, glimpses of order and hospitality that disguised coercion. A guest might be shown through rooms with polished surfaces and perfumed air, meet a smiling attendant in better cloth than usual, be offered entertainment. To the outside eye, Santa Eulália could resemble any wealthy household. Behind closed doors, however, the inequality intensified. Those favored by Antonia moved with privileges that were designed to communicate both reward and threat. The favored men's new status came with not only food and cloth, but the authority, sometimes enforced by the mistress herself, to monitor and discipline the larger enslaved population.
No human arrangement like this is self-contained. The establishment of a privileged inner circle produced ripple effects through the senzalas. Rations were altered. tasks were reallocated. A worker who had previously shared a pot of beans with neighbors found the pot diminished. Testimonies from household members and senzala residents, transcribed in the Inquisition records, complained that food and fuel were diverted to sustain the Casa Grande's staff. Existing survival strategies were strained until resentments accumulated into a palpable social corrosion. This corrosion took forms both subtle and explosive. Privilege corrodes trust in a system that depends on collective labor to survive. Enslaved people, whose lives were already a continuous calculus of risk and reward, began to navigate new hierarchies within their own community. The favored men were both benefactors and agents, sometimes mercilessly enforcing the mistress's will to retain their small advantages. Enslaved women and men resented the visible disparity. Whispers spread. Stories circulated in the market towns visited by troperos and muleteers. A priest passing through would note the oddness of certain servants wearing items uncommon in provincial households. The community around Santa Eulalia could feel, in its ways, that something was amiss, and those frictions only deepened the isolation and secrecy of the Casa Grande. The church noticed. Father Anselmo, the parish priest, features in the archival record as one who received reports and rumors. He was, by temperament and position, a mediator of public morality, a man who could consign sin to confession rather than to public shame. According to his notes, he observed children and servants who wore strange trappings, and he recorded testimonies from visiting families who were uncomfortable with the house's arrangements. In his role, Anselmo attempted at times to inquire discreetly. His inquiries generated cautious answers and sometimes evasions. The church's reluctance to expose scandal collided with the estate's desire for secrecy. Religious institutions performed an odd double duty, guardians of public virtue while also embedded in the same networks that protected local elites. There were witnesses who did not prefer discretion. Joanna was one of them. A domestic worker whose labors included cleaning and serving in the main house, Joanna occupied a precarious position between the intimacy of the mistress's household and the solidarity of the senzalas. Her testimony survives, in part, in later inquisitorial interrogations. She claimed to have seen, on a particular afternoon, a gathering in one of the Casa Grande's rooms, a gathering she described as exploitative and demeaning. Her account, as summarized in the files, is blunt. She witnessed the enforced sexual use of enslaved men as part of the mistress's entertainments.
Joanna's language in the depositions is restrained but devastating in its implications. She framed what she saw as acts of domination arranged by Antonia with the complicity of those who benefited from her favor. To speak, though, was to risk reprisal. The response to Joanna's alleged disclosure was swift and punitive. According to several depositions, she was seized, publicly beaten, and given 50 lashes as a warning. The number and cruelty of the lashes are recorded in varying detail across documents. Some judicial notes quantify the punishment, some witnesses offer a narrative that makes the scene unbearable to read. The purpose of such punishment was clear: to discipline, to terrorize, to enforce silence. The public nature of the whipping was meant to reshape the environment of rumor into one of fear. The spectacle of discipline performed by those in power intended to close mouths and quell movement. Punishments like Joanna's did not erase resentment, they inflamed it. Among the enslaved population, beatings and threats served not only as immediate terror, but also as proof of the mistress's willingness to use brutality to secure her secrets. Those who had tolerated indignities now counted the cost of silence in blood and in hope squandered. Stories of gifts to favored men and the punishments of the many circulated like tinder. Some among the enslaved, those who had nothing left to lose, those who watched family members suffer, began to consider the possibility of direct action. Helena was a figure who bridged worlds. Working in the kitchen, she had access to overheard conversations and the movement of supplies. She also kept the trust of women in the senzalas who sought small mercies from the household. According to accounts preserved in the Inquisition file, she began to pass information to a group of conspirators: names, routines, shifts of soldiers, even the placement of keys.
In a society where literacy was scarce, oral intelligence framed large decisions. Helena's spycraft was not a romantic tale of espionage. It was the lifeline of people who sought to undo a system that punished complaint with steel. Tomei emerged as the conspiratorial leader in this gathering of disgruntled laborers and household servants. The records characterize him as forceful, known for hard work in the mills and for a reputation that combined respect with a fierce sense of justice. He was not a man of words more than necessary. Rather, his authority came from deeds and from the capacity to organize. Around him gathered perhaps 60 people, a number recorded in trial notes and cross-examinations. Men and women who were tired of the calculus that turned their bodies and labor into public spectacle and private amusement.
The exact size of the group is indefinite in some sources. The number 60 appears repeatedly in judicial recountings, but may be inflated by those who later sought to impress the scope of the crime, or conversely, to magnify the danger when justifying harsh reprisals. What is clear is the group's intent, to strike at the heart of what they saw as the betrayal of their humanity. The planning was both pragmatic and desperate. The conspirators learned the routines of sentinel shifts, the timing of supper, and the days when visitors came and left. They scavenged tools, machetes, clubs, and fired up grievances, and they assigned tasks. Some were to seize the favorites and bring them to a makeshift tribunal. Others were to secure the mistress and prevent escape. Others would go to the senzales to rouse those who hesitated. Their strategy depended less on hope of leniency than on the calculation that sudden and decisive action might break the cycle of humiliation. It was, in their view, a remedy proportional to the wrongs they had endured. Rumors about the conspirators circulated in the market towns. A troop of troperos passing near Santa Eulália in late summer noticed an unusual quiet. A neighbor reported odd fires lit late into the night. These peripheral observations, when gathered later in court, suggested that the rebellion did not emerge from nowhere, but from a complex weave of rumor's suppression, and structural pressure. To the colonists and magistrates who received the account after the event, the notion that people could form an anti-estate coalition was both alarming and instructive. It demonstrated that even a supposedly immobilized population could, under unbearable pressure, create institutions of resistance. Antonia, for her part, seemed oblivious to the full measure of what coalesced against her, or perhaps she believed her control extended farther than it did. Her management style had already eroded traditional restraints. According to contemporaneous letters, she prized discretion, yet appeared confident in the loyalty she had purchased. The favored men, visibly improved in attire and condition, carried with them a new aura that suggested their mistress's protection could be relied upon. That aura collapsed the moment the first public denunciation, Joanna's witnessing and subsequent beating, entered common knowledge and became impossible to hide. The public lash served to amplify rather than erase the offense, turning a private crime into a communal grievance. By the time the conspirators completed their plans, the estate was set for a festival, a gathering that would draw servants, visitors, and the mistress's inner circle into a single moment of loosened vigilance. Festivals in colonial life served to blur the lines between work and leisure, to celebrate harvest or a patron saint, and to offer the powerful an occasion for display. To those who plotted against the Casa Grande, the festival presented an opportunity. With watchfulness relaxed and the mistress's attention elsewhere, the house's vulnerabilities would be exposed. The night before the scheduled festival, the conspirators met in the dark of the senzalas and in shaded groves beyond the sugar tanks. Tomei outlined the operation with a quiet clarity. Seize the favorites, bring them to a public space, and subject them to a reckoning that would be witnessed by the people who had been rendered silent for so long. Whether the conspirators intended immediate executions or a staged public humiliation to reassert community standards, the records differ. Some depositions later testified to a plan of symbolic justice. Others admitted the decision to execute had been taken in the heat of the moment. This ambiguity is a pattern in the documents. Intent is often shadowed by consequence. What the papers do show is that the conspirators felt pushed to force the issue by seizing the instruments of domination and turning them before the world that had been forbidden from seeing. They moved at dusk, carrying makeshift torches. The cane fields hid them, the sugar rustling like silent consent. The approach to the main house drew breath out of more than one chest. They were, in those hours, not only conspirators, but people who had rehearsed the moral language of their community. This is theft. This is promiscuity. This is theft of life. The calculus they operated under mixed elemental survival with an ethic born of shared suffering. It made them resolute. At the edge of Santa Eulalia's courtyard, as torches pressed upwards and doors were reached, there remained an instant of potential divergence. The conspirators could have retreated. They could have sent a petition to the nearest government official. They could have attempted to bargain with the mistress through intermediaries. The records show none of these alternatives prevailed. Thomé's group, fueled by the memory of Joanna's lashes and by the daily indignities funneled into the senzalas, chose rupture. What they did next would be the moment that turned a household scandal into a public crisis, and would in turn draw the long arm of colonial justice towards Santa Eulalia in a way that no ledger and no promise could fully contain. When they reached the threshold, the light from torches pooled on worn stone. Inside, the Casa Grande's rooms were arranged to keep intimacy private, to keep secrets in. Outside, the conspirators' faces glistened with sweat and determination. The house that had been built as a refuge for one woman's appetite had become at last the site of a demand for justice by those who had been systematically humiliated.
They seized the favorites as they could. Some were taken from beds, cuffed in pairs, and dragged through corridors that had been built to keep most people out. Some were found in the Casa Grande's private rooms, in garments that marked them apart. The light from the torches threw their improved clothing into sharp relief, silk glinting, a brass button catching flame, making visible in a sudden way the evidence of the mistress's investments. To see those clothes on men pulled from the senzalas was to read aloud the ledger of abuse. Once captured, the favored men were dragged into the courtyard beneath the open sky. A ring of faces formed, enslaved women and men, a handful of hired workers, neighbors who had run to the scene, and the mistress herself, summoned or seized in the hubbub, her hair thrown, her jewelry clinking with panic. The conspirators improvised a tribunal in that courtyard. It was not a court recognized by law. It had no parchment, no notary seal, but it had witnesses and accusation, and for those present it carried moral weight. The makeshift tribunal aimed at public reckoning. Testimony in later depositions, recorded in the Inquisition documents, recounts a cacophony of accusations: theft of food, betrayal of kin, enforced sexual servitude, the selling of favors for silk and rum. Voices named the favored men not as caricatures, but as agents of a system that had converted intimacy into currency. Joanna's earlier testimony, her description of what she had seen and the display that followed, hung over the proceedings like a fact already admitted into communal memory. Several witnesses, according to the same files, insisted the favorites had been complicit in enforcing the mistress's rules, sometimes beating those who resisted or reporting people for lesser infractions. Historians must acknowledge limits. The records do not cohere into a single objective transcript. The Inquisition files were produced by officials whose priorities skewed toward moral condemnation and legal order. They recorded what they could: names, sequences, punishments. But depositions vary on motive and detail. In some accounts, the conspirators intended to designate the favorites to be stripped of their perks and publicly humiliated. In others, they moved toward execution with a speed and ferocity that surprised the planners themselves. Intent, in the archives, is sometimes indefinido. What is less ambiguous is outcome. The 8 men singled out in later inventories, Benedito, Joaquim, Sebastián, Antonio, Francisco, Miguel, Carlos, and Domingos, were killed that night, according to multiple testimonies preserved in the court records. The documents differ on how many died by immediate violence and how many were later executed after capture by the authorities. Some depositions claim summary deaths at the hands of conspirators. Others suggest the favorites were mortally wounded during the struggle and then finished in hurried sentences. Intent, in the archives, is sometimes indefinido. What is less ambiguous is outcome. The 8 men singled out in later inventories, Benedito, Joaquim, Sebastián, Antonio, Francisco, Miguel, Carlos, and Domingos, were killed that night, according to multiple testimonies preserved in the court records. The documents differ on how many died by immediate violence and how many were later executed after capture by the authorities. Some depositions claim summary deaths at the hands of conspirators. Others suggest the favorites were mortally wounded during the struggle and then finished in hurried sentences.
The Inquisition file frames the actions as both murder and righteous retribution, an interpretation the magistrates would not tolerate. Descriptions of the executions in the depositions are stark without indulgence. Witnesses tell of men bound, placed before the crowd, and condemned with words that mixed accusation and grief. A neighbor recorded seeing several of the favorites fall beneath blows. A woman from the Senzalas later described the forearms of those who struck, not in detail of anatomy, but in the memory of force. The archival record notes injuries, blood, unconsciousness. It does not dwell on explicit physical detail. Where the documents report the moment of death, they do so in language filtered through juridical fury. The Inquisition, which later catalogued the event as part sin and part criminality, noted the killings as signs of disorder that threatened public peace. The death of the favored men was both symbolic and practical. Symbolic because the favorites were stockpiles of the mistress's power made visible. Take them away and you unraveled an apparatus of domination. Practical because the favorites had functioned as gatekeepers, controlling access to food, mediating directives, and excluding many from the mistress's small circle of unburdened survival. By choosing them as targets, Tomé and his cohort sought to sever an instrument of humiliation. The conspirators then turned to Antonia. Accounts diverge on whether she was captured awake in a central room or roused from sleep by a commotion and immediately handed over. Some witnesses, recorded in inquisitorial depositions, describe her as defiant, clutching at a rosary or to her jewelry. Others recall a woman who seemed disoriented, muttering about betrayal. The records agree, however, that she was brought before the crowd and subjected to a form of judgment that blended punishment and catharsis. She was accused publicly of turning the house into a site of enforced vice, of converting the daily labor of enslaved people into fuel for her secret entertainments. Those accusations were not merely moral, they alleged systemic theft of food, of autonomy, of future liberty. What happened to Antonia in the hours after the raid is recorded in layers of legal documents, ecclesiastical notes, and neighborly letters that sometimes do not agree. Some claim conspirators proposed a summary punishment. Others say they intended merely to humiliate and to send a signal that the community would no longer permit the interior marketization of bodies. According to the Inquisition file lodged later in Lisbon, however, the conspirators did not kill Antonia. They left her alive, though stripped of some material markers of status, and escorted to a nearby town by a convoy of those who feared a swift return to oppression. How much of this was negotiation, how much was impulse, and how much was fear of retribution is indefinitive in the papers. The morning after, Santa Eulália looked like the scene of another kind of harvest. The great house's windows were broken or open, curtains charred or thrown back. The Casa Grande bore the marks of intrusion. Neighbors gathered. Word reached the Ovidor and the Capitán Mor, the provincial officials whose duty lay in preserving order and reporting upward. Soldiers were dispatched. The reaction of colonial power to such an event had a logic of its own, swift, symbolically punitive, and designed to reassert sovereignty over bodies that had briefly reclaimed themselves.
When soldiers arrived, they encountered a mixture of confusion, rage, and exhaustion. The conspirators were not professional revolutionaries. They were exhausted people who had run on adrenaline for one fierce night. Many fled into the fields or were rounded up. According to trial records, roughly 60 men and women were later accused of participation, some arrested, some sold or dispersed by flight. The figures vary in different depositions. The number 60 appears repeatedly but may be imprecise. The colonial magistrates had an interest in delineating a scope large enough to justify harsh measures and small enough to show the insurrection had been contained. The precise tally, therefore, is indefinito. Tomé, whose leadership had been at the rebel core, was identified, captured, and held. The legal machinery of the colony moved in parallel. Criminal courts assembled testimony that would be forwarded to Lisbon, the military secured the property, the church sought moral framing. The Inquisition took a particular interest not in the political mechanics of rebellion alone, but in the moral impurity it revealed, a private vice turned public scandal. Its agents cataloged depositions, gathered lists of goods taken from the Casa Grande, and recorded statements from strategic witnesses, such as Father Anselmo and Joanna. These files would later be quoted as if they offered a single, unified truth. In fact, they reflected the perspectives of actors whose long-term stakes diverged. Trials followed. Tomé and several others were brought before colonial jurisprudence. The records show that the court aimed at exemplary sentences. Tomé was tried not merely for murder, but for fomenting insurrection and for disturbing public peace, charges that combined to justify capital punishment in the eyes of the regime. Trial minutes, preserved in provincial protocols, describe witnesses recounting the planning and the night's violence. Technical procedures such as the assignment of a defensor, the reading of charges, and the appeals that might be made to Lisbon are recorded with bureaucratic care. The court handed down severe sentences. Tomé was condemned and executed. Official notices speak of the execution as necessary to re-establish order. Other conspirators received a range of punishments: public lashings, forced labor, sale within and beyond the province, or imprisonment.
A handful were branded and transported to other estates where they would disappear into debt bondage or harsher fields. The variability of punishment and the use of sale as both punishment and economic disposal made clear the dual logic of retribution and economic utility. The favored men's deaths were not legally arranged by the Crown's courts. They were violent, extrajudicial acts with moral claims. The legal aftermath instead focused more intently on the rebellion itself and the disorder it implied. The colonial judiciary, however, did not act solely as an arm of repression. It also attempted to produce a narrative that would contain scandal by channeling it into predictable categories: crime, sin, punishment, categories that would reassure the broader society that hierarchy would be restored. Confiscation of property was one such instrument. The estate of Santa Eulália was declared, in subsequent legal actions, subject to penalty and confiscation. Notarial documents compiled inventories of lost and damaged goods. Lists were made of silks, mirrors, furniture, and the items recorded in the Casa Grande's ledgers. Sales were arranged. Some records show that ledgers once used to pay favored men were now read as evidence of misappropriation. Notarial acts transfer ownership in a way that both redistributed property and signaled moral cleansing. By removing the mistress's immediate control, authorities recast the estate as a subject of public management. Yet dispossession was not justice for the enslaved. The confiscation's beneficiaries were often other elites or the crown, not the victims of exploitation. Antonia's fate after the arrests became the subject of gossip and official reports. Parish notes and letters suggest she was escorted to a relative's house, then confined to a nearby city home under guard. In some depositions, she was said to be under a kind of house arrest while physicians and clerical officials assessed her capacity for management, reports that carried the language of both compassion and censure. The Inquisition file claims she was declared mentally unfit to run the estate, and later committed to a convent or to an asylum-like institution. Other documents contradict this, suggesting instead a temporary confinement meant to separate her from the property until its legal fate was settled. The precise details of her confinement, location, duration, terms, are indefinido in the surviving corpus. For the wider community in São Paulo, the case became a moral spectacle and a legal test. It raised questions about how colonial society would handle the private vices of the elite when those vices spilled into form that threatened public peace. The Church's role grew more complicated. Father Anselmo's earlier hesitations had been replaced by participation in the official record. He provided testimony and counsel that, by the eyes of some parishioners, made him complicit in the same networks of authority that had sheltered Antonia.
The Inquisition's interest in cataloging sin meant that moral outrage was translated into a bureaucratic dossier rather than, say, into meaningful restitution for the enslaved. What of the enslaved themselves who had risked everything that night? The answer folds into the harsh arithmetic of colonial justice. Official proceedings punished rebel leaders more severely than the execution of the favorites. Yet the revolt had produced immediate changes on the ground. A scattering of families, altered labor regimes in neighboring estates, and a new caution among planters about how they displayed private authority. Some enslaved people faced harsher rationing and stricter oversight in the weeks after the rebellion, an expected retaliatory logic. Others found themselves sold or transferred as owners sought to fragment communities that had shown their capacity to organize. The Inquisition and colonial courts documented all of this, but their records cannot be read as neutral truth. They are testimony shaped by power and fear. Where the archive speaks with certainty, it does so through instruments that defended the existing order. Where it is silent or contradictory, the historian must not fill the gaps with melodrama, but report the limits. Thus, when documents claim that the Casa Grande's demolition followed swiftly as a moral act, the truth is more mundane and more telling. Structures were repurposed, rooms sealed, inventories scrubbed or dispersed. Sometimes demolition served the purposes of erasure. The physical removal of a house's wings is also a removal of memory. In other cases, the rooms were used by new owners, their meanings recast. The aftermath rippled into the law. Magistrates and colonial officials re-examined how to monitor the domestic sphere without creating precedents that might upset property rights. The episode at Santa Eulália offered a dilemma. Intervene too much and you risk alienating the colony's elite. Intervene too little and you risk uprisings that could spread. The compromises that followed were bureaucratic and incremental. Colonial authorities tightened certain surveillance mechanisms, insisted on more detailed inventories of property and of enslaved persons, and recommended to Lisbon ongoing oversight in cases where moral scandal could not be contained by provincial courts alone. Whether these measures produced real protection for the most vulnerable is doubtful. They functioned primarily to hedge the power of the crown and the local magnates against uncontrolled disorder. Memory, too, was a contested site. The narrative that became official history was not a single story, but a palimpsest. Official narrators, clerics, magistrates, and some neighbors framed the events as an aberration, a lapse in moral taste turned violent. For the enslaved community, the story was of a desperate justice, a claim that the household had been turned into a chamber of commerce for bodies. Those meanings could not coexist easily. The official record's language reasserted hierarchy while the lived memory of those who survived carried different marks, songs, absences, familial ruptures, and migrations. Over decades, the visible traces of Santa Eulália faded. The land was parceled, fields replanted, the Casa Grande's stones reused. Yet the archive preserved paper traces, inventories, depositions, notarial acts that sullenly testified to the event's existence. What did the episode reveal about the logic of slavery? It revealed the inevitable tendencies of absolute power when applied to a coerced population. Where authority is unchecked, private appetites assume public force.
Where the law legitimizes ownership of other people, it creates incentives for camouflaged abuses. Antonia's ability to transform portions of a house into a space where she exercised intimate dominion over bodies was not an accident of temperament alone. It was possible because a legal order permitted the commodification of persons and the creation of microeconomies within estates. The favorites were both beneficiaries and instruments of that system. Their fate, gilded briefly, then killed, shows the fragility of intermediary status within enslaving systems. Favor could buy momentary privileges, but could not ultimately annul the structural violence that made such favor necessary. Resistance, too, took many forms. The revolt was not merely an act of revenge. It was a political argument. Bodies will not remain mere instruments indefinitely. Tomé's leadership suggests the way in which social authority could be remade in the senzalas, through embodied reputation, through the network of kitchen workers, and through the dissemination of small, crucial pieces of intelligence. Helena's role as an information conduit highlights how women in domestic positions could enact forms of subversion without adopting the dramatic pose of open revolt. Joanna's courage in speaking out against abuse shows the limits and potentials of witness. These acts together made the night possible. They also demonstrate how agency pierces systems that appear total. The colonial reaction, execution, confiscation, and an inquisition dossier was paradoxical. The legal order punished rebellion and recorded sin. In doing so, it reasserted the terms of its authority. Yet the official record also testified, however obliquely, to the vulnerabilities of that order. Officials worried about contagion. They worried about precedent. They worried that if communities could decide justice independent of the crown, the social fabric would be forever altered. That fear would shape later policies. But policy cannot resolve the human consequences. Families were split, names erased from books, children sold, and reputations torn. The favored men's deaths were a direct, brutal answer to a private tyranny. The colonial punishments that followed were a different kind of violent answer designed to restore balance by force.
The Inquisition's files, read centuries later, are both a blessing and a problem for memory. They preserve depositions that might otherwise have vanished. They also frame the event within a language of sin and disorder that deflects structural inquiry. Reading the archives against the grain yields a more complicated picture. The Casa Grande's luxury was not merely aesthetic, it functioned as a mechanism of governance. The favorite's clothing and duties were not mere adornment, but the outward signs of an internal administrative logic. The revolt, then, is legible as an exposing of that logic. It is also a warning about the brittleness of domination when concentrated in the hands of a few. In the decades that followed, Santa Eulalia's name appears intermittently in municipal records, sales, mortgages, and claims of inheritance. Each entry is a small aftershock. Sometimes the estate is reassembled under a new owner who never mentions the Casa Grande's old wing. Sometimes it is parceled for debt repayment. Local oral histories preserve hints. Tales of a room that would not be entered, of a ghost that limped across the yard at dusk, of goods found in odd bundles under floorboards. These stories cannot be trusted as history in the archival sense, but they are important. They show how communities absorb trauma when official records would rather name it a scandal and forget it. How should we remember this event now? The temptation is to reduce it to a shocking headline. A mistress, 8 favored men, an orgy, a revolt, a ruin. That is the spine of the story, and the title that brings you here. Yet the flesh of the matter is broader and sorrowful. The Casa Grande was not a mere scandal. It was one node in a system of exploitation that validated the confiscation of human integrity for private pleasure. The conspirators' actions were brutal, and for many, the rebellion ended in tragedy. Yet their act was also an assertion that such a system could be contested from within. That paradox is the point. The night destroyed the mistress's capacity to conceal abuses, but it also unleashed retaliations that further concentrated suffering in unexpected ways. There are lessons in the record for how colonial institutions handled crises of private vice. They preferred to convert shame into legal paperwork. They preferred to punish revolt rather than reform the conditions that birthed it. The Inquisition's cataloging of sin offered the appearance of moral clarity while often defending social hierarchies. The operative logic was not abolition or even amelioration, it was containment. Confiscation served to discipline the image of propriety without offering substantive redress to those actively harmed. Today, in modern São Paulo, the land that once supported Santa Eulália may be overwritten by roads and neighborhoods. The names of the favored men are preserved in the brittle ink of archival lists and in the footnotes of scholarship.
Their human details, Benedito's literacy, Joaquim's son, Miguel's laugh, are small windows into lives otherwise flattened by ledger entries. To read them is to resist the erasure that bureaucratic memory tends toward. We do not close the case neatly. Documents in Lisbon and in provincial archives disagree. Some modern narratives render Antonia as monstrous and the conspirators as heroes. Others frame the episode as an unfortunate breakdown of order. The nuanced truth sits somewhere in between. Antonia's actions, according to records, were abusive and exploitative. The conspirators' violence, according to the same records, was both criminal and an expression of long-denied justice. The historian must hold both truths at once and must avoid the seductive simplification of villain and hero. When we ask why a private pleasure house could ignite such catastrophe, the answer is structural. Slavery itself created the conditions in which personal appetites could be enforced through legal purchase and social normalization. The Casa Grande was a symptom of a larger illness. The revolt was a desperate attempt at remedy that collapsed into more violence because the legal and moral instruments available to resolve such abuses were configured to protect property and not people. If there is a final irony, it is this: the very secrecy that enabled the mistress's private wing, its curtains, locked doors, silenced servants, also made the house vulnerable to exposure. The attempt to hide oppression required a mechanism of surveillance and a cadre to enforce silence. When that mechanism broke, it did so spectacularly. The pleasure house did not simply ruin reputations. By concentrating power in a narrow enclave, it concentrated risk. It transformed private vice into public crisis and, in doing so, forced the colony to confront the question it otherwise preferred to ignore. What price do we pay for systems that treat people as property? The archival record ends, as far as it goes, with lists and penalties, confiscations, trials, executions, transfers of land. But the human consequences continued beyond the inked margins. Children learning without fathers, women carrying scars both visible and concealed, communities reassembling themselves under new owners while old secrets were either exported or buried. The Casa Grande's stones might have been repurposed. Its memories persisted in songs and in the silences around hearths. History, however, demands attention. It demands that we name abuses when evidence supports the claim, and that we qualify details when the papers are contradictory. It demands that we center those who suffered and not merely those who held power. In the records of 1763, voices like Joanna's and Helena's pierce through fog of official language. Their presence is a reminder that eyewitness testimony, even when penalized, can leave traces that later generations can follow. The mistress, who built a building of private pleasure with the labor and bodies of others, remains, in the archives, a cautionary emblem. The 8 men whose lives were transformed into instruments of spectacle and then into the target of revenge are reminders of the human costs of systems that commodify intimacy. The revolt at Santa Eulália is a cautionary tale of how unchecked power and enforced secrecy, when stacked on top of an economy of dispossession, can produce both perverse luxuries and violent ruptures. As we close this account, consider what remains unsettled in the files. Exact numbers,
certain sequences, the precise terms of Antonia's confinement. These are often recorded as indefinido across sources. The historian's job is not to invent, but to narrate with care, flagging the points where evidence thins. Where the archive is loudest, lists of goods, names, and punitive sentences, there we have purchase. Where it is silent, on interior feeling, on the intimate negotiations that shaped promises of manumission, we must respect that silence. The ruins of Santa Eulalia, whether literal or archival, are not merely evidence of a past scandal. They are the site of questions that reverberate into our present. How does power hide its corruption? Who bears the cost when private vice becomes public harm? What forms of accountability were possible in a society that legalized the ownership of people? These questions are uncomfortable because answers implicate structural features that persisted long past 1763. The phrase that brought you to this story, the mistress who built her pleasure house with 8 slaves, the orgy that ruined an empire in SP 1763, frames the narrative as spectacle. The spectacle is real, but it should not obscure the sorrow beneath. A house of pleasure was not mere entertainment. It was an institutional innovation in domination. Its ruin did not restore justice. It redistributed suffering. The episode ruptured the social order and revealed the volcanic edges of a system built on commodified bodies. If this story moves you, if it unsettles or compels you to look further, consider this final invitation. Subscribe for more deep dives into colonial scandals and archival investigations, and share this episode with someone who cares about history, that remembers, so the names left in dusty ledgers do not vanish without being read.